Welcome to the Diadem. We are a small group, and I've written a book. This book was written to capture my journey from a lifetime of forced astral attack to poltergeist activity, navigating through the wolves of the corrupt and sold-out church and the BS New Age, and finally, through a very small Bible study group and what we've learned. Believe me, I'm pissed right off. In the future, we're going to add controversial and truth-seeking Bible study series based on the lessons learned in this book. We may not have all the answers, but we've got a lot of them. And we hope you join us with an open mind. Chapter 9, Part B, the Hellenistic origins of the Logos. Throughout history, the early church's adoption of theological constructs, such as the eternal Son Logos, the virgin birth, and the doctrine of Jesus' baptism, have been contentious issues. These concepts did not evolve naturally from the teachings of Jesus, nor his 12 apostles, but were manipulated and infused with pagan philosophies, deviating sharply from the true message of Christ. This deliberate syncretism aimed to align Christianity with Hellenistic and Roman ideologies, ultimately corrupting and blaspheming the original faith. Plato's philosophical system introduced the idea of the Logos as an eternal, unchanging principle that governs the cosmos. Now, the Logos in this context was not a person, but an abstract principle of reason and order. This concept was further developed by later Hellenistic philosophers, including the Jewish thinker Philo of Alexandria. Oh, those Egyptians. Philo, who lived in the 1st century, sought to harmonize Jewish theology with Greek philosophy. He described the Logos as an intermediary, a second God, through whom the supreme God interacted with the material world. Philo's writings provided a bridge between Jewish monotheism at the time and Hellenistic thought, which early Christian theologians exploited to align Jesus with his philosophical Hellenistic construct. Prominent early church fathers, held up by the church, are simply a bunch of pagans arguing with each other about how their philosophies should be attached to the name Jesus. These men, falsely revered as Christian, played pivotal roles in embedding the Logos doctrine into Christian theology. These figures did not convert to the teachings of Jesus, but rather sought to integrate their Hellenistic philosophical training into the nascent Christian faith. Examples: Justin Martyr. See what you find that they have in common. His background: a former Stoic and Platonist, Justin Martyr claimed to embrace Christianity, but continued to interpret it through the lens of Greek philosophy. Writings in his first apology, Justin identifies Jesus as this Logos, this Hellenistic Logos, arguing that he existed externally and participated in the creation. This portrayal aligns much more with the Platonic and Philonic thought than with the monotheistic teachings of Jesus and his Father. Clement of Alexandria, another convert from Greek paganism. Clement was deeply influenced by Platonic thought. Clement's work are rife with references to the Logos as a pre-existent divine principle, not merely an attribute of God, but a distinct person within the Godhead. Origen. Although raised by Christian parents, Origen's extensive education in Greek philosophy profoundly influenced his theology. Origen's description of Jesus as the Logos, who existed before time, created by God, reflects the synthesis of Christianity and Platonism. Now, the Council of Nicaea and Constantine's influence can't be overstated, but also can't be understated. The integration of the Logos doctrine into Christian orthodoxy was solidified at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This council was convened by Emperor Constantine to address the Arian controversy, which questioned the divinity of Christ. This means, essentially, that groups of pagan Greeks claiming to be Christians, later labeled brilliant church fathers by the Christian establishment, were arguing over Jesus and denying his humanity with various philosophies that better suited their pagan gods. So the council adopted the Logos, quote unquote, eternal son theory, asserting that Christ, the Logos, was the same substance as the Father. The Nicene Creed promoted the eternal Son, describing Jesus as begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. Now, this language echoes the philosophical construct of the Logos and deviates from the Hebraic understanding of the Messiah, who was human, son of Adam. Let's just stop a minute here. The reason Jesus's humanity is so critically important in the biblical narrative is Jesus's job as the second Adam is to reverse what happened in the garden. Okay? So the second human, Adam, son of David. The root of David is Adam, right? The son of David is Jesus. He's both ends of David. It is a patriarchal family lineage of the Messiah to reverse what happened in the garden. That's the whole thing here, okay? It's not some human sacrifice cult. So, of course, one lie leads to the next, because the eternal Son must be eternal, yet also birthed, which is a completely ridiculous notion to begin with. To further understand the historical context of this religious syncretism, consider the influence of Julia Massilia, a powerful matriarch in the Roman Empire during the Severan dynasty. Born in Emesa, Syria, she promoted the worship of the sun god Baal, or El Gabal, through her grandson, Elagabalus, I can never say his name, Elagabalus, also known as Varius Avitus Bassianus, who promoted the worship of El Gabal, aligning Roman state religion with the Syrian sun god, and this was around 220 AD. Now, this religious syncretism highlights the persistent infiltration of pagan elements into Roman religious practices. Constantine sought to unify the empire under a single and powerful religious framework. So his conversion to Christianity was as much a political move as a personal one, aimed at consolidating power. Now, Constantine's mother, Helena, was also influenced by pagan traditions, including the worship of Sol Invictus. The integration of the Logos doctrine can be seen as a continuation of this syncretism. Much like Dionysus's revenge in the Bacchae, Paul's magical light quoted in Acts, lasting centuries. This eternal Son entity dogma invented to cover up this nonsense of pagan Greek church fathers arguing their philosophies of Nicaea resulted in endless amounts of BS doctrines, biblical corruptions, murder, torture, exile, and persecution of anyone who disagreed for 1,700 years. This theological formulation was simply the good old pagan eternal Logos, influenced by Greek philosophical concepts, particularly Platonism, which emphasized the idea of a divine, eternal logos mediating between God and creation. By emphasizing the logos, early church leaders shifted focus from Jesus's Davidic royal patriarchal lineage to an entity called the Logos, while attaching Jesus's name to their narrative and capitalizing the unambiguous, uncapitalizable Greek in the book of John, while attaching Jesus's name to the whole thing and packaging it as Christianity. This move was part of a broader agenda to align Christian theology with Hellenistic philosophy, which often downplayed historical and genealogical aspects in favor of metaphysical and mystical interpretations. So let's dive down into the virgin birth narrative and some of the pagan myths. The virgin birth narrative was another construct invented by the early church to align Christianity with prevailing pagan ideologies. It was really hip to have a virgin birth. Let's just say it like that. The story of a divine birth was not unique to Christianity, but was prevalent in various pagan myths. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible, provides genealogies that challenge the virgin birth narrative. In Matthew's genealogy, early manuscripts state Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, without implying a miraculous virgin birth. This suggests that the early Christian community didn't universally endorse the virgin birth narrative. Paul's letters. Paul consistently emphasizes Jesus' descent from David without mentioning a virgin birth. Romans 1:3 states concerning the Son who was descended from David according to the flesh. That means something. It's the Adamic lineage to David and the Davidic lineage to Jesus. James and Jude, as Jesus's brothers, they would likely have highlighted any unique aspects of Jesus's birth, if there were any. Their epistles make no mention of a virgin birth. Jesus himself. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus emphasizes his connection to David and his humanity by referring to himself as the Son of Man and highlighting that Davidic lineage without mentioning a miraculous virgin birth. The virgin birth narrative, while central to mainstream Christian theology, aligns closely with various pagan myths that predate and parallel the Christian account. Now, these myths often involve miraculous conceptions and divine births, suggesting that the early church may have incorporated these elements to make Christianity more appealing to converts familiar with such stories. Two prominent figures in these early paganistic debates were Rufinus and Jerome, our two sons of hell. We've mentioned these guys before. Rufinus and Jerome aimed to make Greek theological concepts accessible to the Latin-speaking world, but their differing interpretations led to intense rivalry. However, both Jerome and Rufinus are known for translating original manuscripts with very strategic edits to align with the newly adopted eternal Son doctrine. Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin was a monumental task that involved significant interpretation and at times outright manipulation of the original text. The early church's efforts to control spiritual narratives were driven by a desire to establish orthodoxy and suppress what they called heresy. So by aligning Christian theology with Greek philosophy and emphasizing the Logos as an eternal Son, church leaders sought to create a unified, universal doctrine that could be enforced by threat of violence and exile across the Roman Empire. Now, Paul's portrayal of Jesus who was also influenced by Greek philosophical constructs, explains why the church dug up and included Paul's writings. His letters often employed concepts such as the logos to explain Christ's nature to pagan Gentiles, while he did a double take asserting a Davidic line when the Hebrews were around. Now, Christianity often hails a hero, the man Constantine himself, who legalized the logos entity monstrosity of corruption. It's hard to buy that Constantine experienced a genuine conversion, given the suspicious nature of his so-called vision and subsequent actions. Constantine claimed he saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer," but written in Latin, before the battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. Curiously, the symbol resembled an X or chi rather than a traditional cross, an image that has since appeared on Masonic medals and insignia, which some interpreted as subverting or crossing out the cross of Jesus. The Latin phrase is often rendered in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. I translated that, in this pagan shit, we're going to conquer Jesus. And it seems they have. They've used Constantine's Christ X over the cross of the man Jesus of Nazareth, son of David, son of Adam. And the Christ, eternal son, Hellenized pagan logos entity, certainly is the one that gets all the attention today. Now, adding to the suspicion, there were rumors surrounding Constantine's scandalous interactions with the apostles' tombs. This suggests that he desecrated or moved the remains of the apostles, particularly Peter and Paul, to consolidate his power and control over the Christian community. According to some accounts, Constantine ordered the transfer of the apostle and Paul's relics to new basilicas he commissioned in Rome, which were built over burial sites. This act was seen by some as an attempt to legitimize his rule and align himself with the apostolic authority, though it fueled further skepticism about the sincerity of his conversion. To make matters worse, it was said that Constantine had the apostles' tombs, or what he claimed were their tombs, surrounding him in his tomb, much like the rays of the sun. This imagery suggests a divine endorsement and a celestial connection, reinforcing his authority and legitimacy. The Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, built by Constantine, was intended as a mausoleum for himself and subsequent emperors, with the tombs of the apostles positioned around his own. Now, this arrangement symbolized Constantine's alignment with apostolic authority and divine favor, further solidifying his rule and the church's endorsement of his reign. No surprise, considering his notorious reverence for pagan practices, like his love for the Oracle of Delphi. Constantine even went so far as to transfer the serpent pillars from Delphi to his new capital, Constantinople, demonstrating his continued pagan inclinations. Although Constantine was baptized, it was ironically done by an Arian bishop who held the controversial belief that Jesus was not divine, but rather an exalted angel. This further complicates the narrative of his conversion and suggests that Constantine's adoption of Christianity was a political maneuver rather than a sincere spiritual transformation. When comparing Constantine's vision to Saul of Tarsus's vision and supposed alleged conversion on the road to Damascus, the parallels of dubious visions leading to claimed divine endorsements only deepen the skepticism surrounding Constantine's authenticity as a Christian convert. Let's take a look at Paul's teachings and the Logos creator entity that he talks about in Colossians. In Colossians 1, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now that, you're not going to get a better definition of the Hellenized Jewish logos than that. Philippians 2, who being in very nature God, whoa. Back to John. We did this earlier in chapter 9. John teaches, if you do not teach that Jesus is human of the flesh, son of Adam, son of David, it is AntiChrist teaching. How many Christian churches are quoting Philippians that goes directly against John's instruction on how to identify Antichrist teachings? It's crazy town that people don't question this. But here's what Philippians says. Who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. So he wasn't human. He was made in human likeness. Ding, ding, ding. That's John's Antichrist. That's what John warns us about Antichrist teaching, right there. In being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This directly contradicts what John tells us to look for Antichrist teaching. It's right here in your Bibles, guys. This passage emphasizes the self-emptying of Christ, who, despite being divine, took on human form and submitted to the limitations and sufferings of humanity. So he wasn't human. He's spirit human. We're right back to Cerinthus and Philo and Paul. Now, Paul's depiction of Jesus as the divine logos, through whom all things were created, closely mirrors that Hellenistic philosophical concepts, particularly of the Jewish philosopher Philo and earlier Greek thought. And later we can see Cerinthus in that Philippians quote. This portrayal elevates Jesus to a cosmic creator role, diverging from the traditional Hebrew understanding of God the Father as the sole creator. According to Deuteronomy 13, any prophet or teacher who leads the people to serve other gods who their fathers did not know is to be considered false. Then, Paul's teachings fundamentally contradict the Hebrew scriptures, providing grounds to dismiss them as unaligned with the true message of God. His teachings qualify him as Antichrist, according to John. Let's look at Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Is it hard for you to kick against the goads, kick against the pricks? Now, the Dionysus quote in this phrase, it's a direct quote from the Euripides play The Bacchae, associated with the pagan sun god Dionysus. This unlikely reference suggests that the entity encountered by Saul certainly didn't align with the teachings of Jesus, raising questions about the authenticity and sources of Paul's revelation. The weeping for Tammuz. This narrative of the virgin birth parallels other ancient myths, such as the story of Tammuz, a Mesopotamian deity whose death and resurrection were deeply embedded in the religious practices of the ancient Near East. Biblical reference for the weeping of Tammuz you can find in Ezekiel. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, the weeping for Tammuz highlights this widespread influence of this deity's myth in the region. Tammuz's death and subsequent resurrection was mourned and celebrated in religious rituals to reflect a cyclical pattern of life, death, and rebirth, which resonated with agricultural societies. According to ancient traditions, Tammuz was considered the rebirth of Nimrod, a mighty hunter and king, after his death. His wife, Semiramis, claimed that Nimrod had been resurrected in the form of their son, Tammuz, who was seen as a fertility god associated with the cycles of nature. Tammuz's death symbolizes seasonal decay, and his return represented the rejuvenation of life. So the incorporation of all of these resurrection motifs from myths like that may have influenced early Christian narrative of that death and resurrection, providing a familiar framework for new converts. The elevation of Mary to status of veneration, akin to that of the pagan queen of heaven, parallels how ancient goddesses were revered, despite Jesus's teachings to the contrary. Biblical references: the children gather wood, their fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me for anger. The prophet Jeremiah denounces the worship of the queen of heaven, a title associated with the goddess Ishtar or Inanna. But Jesus himself said in Luke, as Jesus was speaking these things, a woman in the crowd called out, "Blessed is the mother who gave you birth and nursed you." And Jesus replied, "Oh, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." He is not giving any special place or reverence to his mother, Mary. We go into this very deeply when we take a look at Mary's song and Mary's prayers in this whole part of the first half of Luke. We discuss this really deeply in our Luke series that will be dropping shortly. Jesus explicitly emphasizes that obedience to God is of higher value than biological ties, countering any elevation of Mary to a status beyond that of any other faithful and righteous follower. Now, over time, Mary was increasingly venerated and attributed titles and roles similar to those of ancient goddesses, such as the Queen of Heaven. This development also reflects a syncretic adaptation of Marian devotion to align with pre-existing pagan traditions of goddess worship. The veneration stands in contrast to the direct teachings of Jesus and the early apostles, who emphasized the equality of all believers, sons and daughters of God, before God. This distortion of Mary's role serves as another example of how the early church adopted and adapted pagan elements popular at the time to create a more universally appealing theological framework. Now let's delve into how modern Christian leaders may claim to use the term Christ to emphasize Jesus's messianic role, which aligns with biblical tradition, but in reality, they're insidiously referring to a pagan eternal logos entity. You see, modern preachers use this switcheroo game when they want to quote from the original 12 apostles or quote Jesus himself from biblical text. They'll often call him Jesus. But when they want to talk through Paul's writings, which is like 90% of what they teach in church, or they want to talk about this mystical entity, they don't call it Jesus. They call it the Christ. And that's what you are to worship, is the Christ. Not Jesus, dude. They'll throw him in here and there and use the name Jesus when they're doing a quote from the man of Nazareth. But that's not who they're worshiping, and that's not the man whose teachings they're following. They're just pulling a quote in here and there to slap Jesus's name on their eternal logos pagan teaching. So they took the logos and they attached Jesus's name to it, is essentially what they're doing. And if you listen carefully, you'll see how they use the word Christ as a name of the logos and they're thereby attaching it to Jesus. So you're thinking they're talking about the same thing, but they're not. The term Christ or Christos, simply translated to the anointed one or Messiah. It signifies someone chosen and anointed, such as King David, who is also referred to as the Christ, an anointed one in the Old Testament. Boy, do I make people mad when I say David Christ. Ooh, they get angry at that because they don't understand Greek. The kings of the earth take their stand and rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Here, anointed one refers to David. David Christ, indicating the term Christ was used to denote someone chosen and anointed by God. In contemporary Christian discourse, particularly with certain streams of theology, the term Christ is used interchangeably with Jesus. This creates a subtle but significant shift in people's understanding and manipulation of the text. Modern church leaders might claim they use the word Christ to emphasize Jesus's messianic role, which would be biblically sound because it aligns with the traditional Hebrew understanding of anointed figures like Jesus and David. But instead, they're using the term Christ to refer to this eternal divine Hellenized logos entity that is distinct from Jesus, son of David. This usage creates a conceptual separation between Jesus, son of David, and the Christ, the divine eternal entity. It suggests that while Jesus lived as a human, Christ is an eternal son, divine presence that possessed, inhabited, or incarnated as Jesus at some point. Following that teaching of Cerinthus again, where he flew in at some point and flew off at the cross. Modern church leaders' strategic use of the term Christ to subtly promote this pagan eternal son logos entity instead of the historical Jesus represents a significant theological distortion and huge manipulation. This practice obscures the true nature of Jesus as presented in the Bible. It obscures John's warning against AntiChrist teachers, where the AntiChrist teaches against Jesus as son of Adam, son of David, son of man, human. And it aligns more closely with the Hellenistic and pagan concepts. The interchangeability of Jesus and Christ in modern Christian discourse, while seemingly synonymous, obscures the true nature of Jesus as presented in our Bible. Now, this strategic, and I would argue manipulative use, aligns with promoting that divine eternal son entity, which is separate from Jesus the man, leading to a dualistic understanding that diverges from the original monotheistic faith that Jesus taught about his Father. To preserve the integrity of Christian doctrine, it is essential to maintain a clear distinction between Jesus the man and the role of the Messiah, the chosen one Christ, the anointed one, without conflating the terms to the point of theological distortion. This calls for a critical re-examination of how these terms are used in modern teachings and a return to a more biblically grounded understanding of Jesus Christ, son of David, man from Nazareth. Now, religious leaders in both Judaism and Christianity have historically sought to control spiritual narratives to maintain their authority. For Christianity, particularly after the Council of Nicaea, there was a concerted effort to establish a unified doctrine that emphasized Jesus' divine nature and downplayed or reinterpreted aspects of his human lineage that didn't fit this narrative. This included the erasure or minimization of Jesus' Ephraimite bloodline and construction of several narratives, including the incarnation, the virgin birth, the doctrine of original sin, which would challenge the established theological framework that emphasized his Davidic rulership. Politicians have also played a role in shaping and controlling spiritual narratives to consolidate power and influence. Throughout history, political leaders have aligned themselves with dominant religious ideologies to legitimize their rulership and unify their subjects under a common belief system. By supporting a dominant religious narrative, including the pre-existent divine nature of Jesus and the suppression of any alternate interpretations of his lineage, on threat of death, politicians could ensure the stability and continuity of their reign. This manipulation of religious narratives serves to reinforce their authority and suppress dissent. Now, interestingly, many world leaders even dare claim to rule under the House of David. And why not? Christians have given up the throne, worshiping an unprophesied entity, leaving the seat of the royal Davidic prophecy wide open. The broader agenda behind these efforts was to create a cohesive and controlled spiritual narrative that reinforced the power structures of both religious institutions and political entities. By erasing or altering aspects of Jesus's lineage, religious and political leaders throughout history could present an image of Jesus that did not conflict with their own theological and political goals. This happened in the Old Testament with David. Why wouldn't it happen in the New Testament with Jesus? Your post-Babylonian Davidic redactors, we spoke about them chapters previous, how they conflated the Ephraimite bloodline and the Judahite bloodline in order to legitimize these elites coming back from Babylon who took over everything and wanted to create a centralized worship in Jerusalem and gain that political control. They conflated the bloodlines and chronicles to get, this is way straight to David. It made David a Judahite rather than an Ephraimite of the land in Judah, not of the tribe of Judah. We went through all this in previous chapters. They're doing that in the Old Testament to David. They did the exact same thing in the New Testament with Jesus. This control over spiritual narratives and bloodlines ensures that both religious and political leaders retain their influence and control over the populace. Now, the incorporation of deeply pagan theology, including the virgin birth narrative, the elevation of Mary to status similar to the pagan Queen of Heaven, and the teachings of Paul or Saul of Tarsus that diverge from Hebrew scriptures are all very clear examples of how early church leaders manipulated scriptural interpretations to align Christianity with the prevailing pagan Hellenistic ideologies of the time. These theological constructs were driven by the need to control a wide audience. They were Jewish and Hellenistic in nature. Remember, Jewish and Hebrew, not the same thing. We went over that in chapter 7. And this resulted in a series of Hellenized Jewish doctrinal distortions that diverged sharply from the original teachings of Jesus Christ. We accuse the early church of abandoning the authentic message of Jesus, and every modern church of perpetuating these lies against the true Father and the teachings of his Son in favor of syncretistic theology of an eternal entity that aligns with pagan Greek philosophy, rather than with the true God, Jesus's Father, that he taught us about in Hebrew scriptures. This narrative calls for a critical re-examination of every single sacred cow and foundational Christian belief, and a return to the true teachings of Jesus Christ, free from the distortions of Hellenistic thought and political compromise pushed and promoted by the wolves in the pulpit. Next, we'll move to chapter 10. See you next time.